Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome back. I'm glad so many of you came back. This is a good sign. They're always a very good sign. This is our session 2 of the whole theme, the whole series we're doing called Reason to Believe, looking at the use of our human reason and how it can equip us to be better disciples in the world for people who are looking for reason to believe. So I hope that some of you are kind of catching on to the little play on words that I did there. And straight up front today, what I want to do is, well, 2 things. First of all, I'm going to be sending everybody, if you're not on my email list, would you make sure that I have your email today? And those of you that are in RCIA, I'm going to ask Deacon if he'll forward it maybe to you. But there's 2 really, really good Bishop Barron videos. One of them was done in 2012, while he was still Father Barron. He did and it's brief, it's about 9 minutes, I think, but it's about the whole topic of faith and reason. And it reinforces, or I should say, I guess maybe I reinforced him, but it reinforces what we talked about last week, looking at how those great medieval scholars in the church explored the basics of how we can use logic and reason. And he really does a great job with that. And then there's another one that I just watched that came out, he did last year, that is on the topic we're going to talk about today. It's called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. And again, he addresses it from the perspective that I had already planned to, which is why do we even care about getting to the historical Jesus? Why would we need to know that when we have the Christ of the Gospels? Why do we need to know anything about the Jesus of history? And it all goes back to the reason, remember, no pun intended, but the reason we're doing the series is because we want to be able to help people who are looking for reason to believe. How can we be better equipped to answer questions that come at us? How can we help people who are looking for the Jesus of history to find Jesus the Christ? And so that I'm going to send both of those links to you, and I highly encourage you. The first video is only like, as I said, 8 or 9 minutes, and the second one is like 30 minutes. But it's really very, very well done. So straight up front today, let's identify what you're looking at on the slide. Behind me, the far left is actually a mural from the mural paintings from the catacombs in Rome. It's been dated to about the 4th century. And significant because it marks kind of a shift in the way that Jesus was depicted in catacomb art. The earliest depictions that we have of him in this mural artwork form are as a young Roman man. He has short hair. He's wearing a tunic or a toga in these early depictions in the catacombs. And we think that's because during the early times of persecutions, Christians adopted a sort of an artistic model for Jesus that maybe wouldn't draw too much attention. But he's usually depicted in that early art with a lamb across his shoulders, and that's how he's identified as the Christ. So this marks a shift because by the 4th century we see him depicted in this left upper left. You see that he looks more Semitic. He looks more like the Jesus of art that we know, right? On the far right is the rather famous, probably the most famous early image that we have of Christ. This one dates to the 6th or 7th century. It's called the Christ Pantocrator or Pantocrator, which means Almighty. This is Christ as the judge. And sometimes, if the book is open, sometimes he's holding a closed book of the Gospels with his hands raised in a blessing. That's Christ the judge, or the Pantocrator. And if he has the book open, then it's Christ the teacher. But again, lots of similarities we could talk about if we had more time. And you know how my mind runs sometimes. But if we had more time to talk about that in relation to the cloth on the wall behind me, there's a lot of scholarship about the similarities, points of similarity between the 6th century or early 7th century icon that incidentally is in Mount Catherine's, St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. And we know that that monastery was dedicated to the Emperor Justinian, so this goes back to at least the early 6th century. Again, marking a significant shift in the way Jesus had traditionally been depicted in art to that point in time. And it probably, besides being the oldest Byzantine icon we have of Jesus, if you look at it, how well actually you can see it on the background that is behind those images. Our right, his left, represents his humanity. Do you see the difference in his eyes? Our left, his right, is thought to represent his divinity. The eyes are obviously different, if you can see that. This was probably influenced, we think, by the early councils of the church, who dealt with that major issue of defining the dual nature of Christ. And so that's reflected in this artwork. But there are a lot of people who also believe that the swollen cheek and the swollen eye was taken from the image of the shroud. So it is probably the earliest recognizable image we have of Christ. And then, of course, what's in the center, what you're looking at, is a beautiful gold Byzantine coin from the 7th century, which also depicts Jesus this way. The characteristic features we have come to associate with Jesus in artwork over time, and it is the first time we see it in coinage, that Jesus is not this young Roman male, but now he is the Jesus that we know of art today. So, on the quest for the historical Jesus today, and I guess we could ask ourselves, why? Why we want to do that? And how about first a quick recap and review, if we will, of last week to kind of get back to the overarching idea of this entire series. Faith and reason, remember, our faith and science do not contradict each other, and that's the big idea. Last week we explored the application of logic, which is our human reason, indwelling in each one of us. I'm going to go back and make this point again. This is not something that we have to ask for or look for or cultivate. I guess cultivating it is something we can do, but it is a gift. Our human reason is a gift. It is the divine logos in all of us that seeks to bring order to everything that we take in. We do it all day long on some level that we just instinctively do. But to take that and apply it to questions that we all have, that's sort of the big idea of this whole series, is that we are already hardwired through this use of our logic, the logos dwelling in us. We are already hardwired to know the truth, to reach the truth, that which we are actually programmed for, created for, that ultimate something beyond ourselves. How do we know that? And that's why I want you to watch this little 8 or 9 minute video that Bishop Barron, then Father Barron, did, because he explains this beautifully using the gospel account of Thomas. When Thomas says, I will not believe until I place my hand in his side, right? When he says that, he uses that to explain how our faith, how we come to believe, is not based on nothing. We use reason to get there. Some of us obviously have to do that more than others, maybe. But, so Bishop Barron also, of course, talks about the scholars, the two scholars we talked about last week, St. Anselm of Canterbury and St. Thomas Aquinas. He uses both of them to explain how simple, really, this exercise is of logic and reason, and how it naturally comes to us. So if you weren't here last week, those of you that might not have been here, you can watch that video. It's archived on Facebook. It's also on YouTube. I suspect it's soon going to be on our updated Cathedral webpage that should be up and running very quickly. I also talked last week about the responsibility we have for our ongoing catechesis, right, as adults. You might expect me to say something like that, right? You would expect that from me. But it's probably something you're going to hear me say again, because it's an obligation that we have to learn. And again, this can only make us better disciples in the world. This will only make us better disciples in the world. So what do we mean by the historicity of Jesus, or the historical Jesus, or the Jesus of history, as sometimes he's been called? Well, that generally takes this form. okay? Is there a Jesus that can be known apart from sacred scripture? Is there a Jesus that can be known from independent historical records? This search for the historical Jesus has been a little bit of a challenge, and both from the view of trying to get at that Jesus, the one of history, and not the one of faith, and from the reality that some of these attempts, and I'm going to talk about there's three very distinct waves of this, and they don't start in a good place intellectually. So that's been part of the challenge. Some of these attempts have been taken negatively by Christians, like somehow searching for him as a historical figure diminishes his divinity somehow. That if we emphasize the human Jesus, the historical Jesus, then somehow we are minimizing his divinity, or his role as the second person of the Trinity. And I have to tell you, part of the reason that Christians have received this negatively is because that, I think, is what happened the first time anyone undertook this, was that it did diminish him. It's often done just that, and has produced some, and I'm just going to say it, some truly weird publications and public statements that is perhaps especially true of the form that this movement took in the middle of the 20th century. Right after World War II, that second wave of this that I'm going to talk about was quite negative. And I that's not what I wanted to get at today. I'm not going to make this a negative thing, because I actually see it as a positive. That there is a question out there about, is there a Jesus outside of Scripture? And why do I see that as a positive thing? Because people who are looking for reason to believe don't necessarily want to go to the Bible first, right? That text is authoritative to us. It's sacred to us. We know Jesus is the Christ. But people who are inquiring, wouldn't it be helpful to kind of meet them in a neutral place, perhaps, in a more human sense? So I think that's why this is important. And so what I hope I do, and I don't know if I can do this skillfully or not, but what I hope I do is I can skirt all of the negativity and still talk about it, but not make that the focus of this movement of secular history, for sure. So we are confronted with an important question, I think, that I mentioned this in my email blast on Friday, as important as it might be to get to be on this quest for the Jesus of history, I think it might be more important to ask ourselves why we do this, and that's what I'm getting at today, is for people who may not know Jesus as Christ, but might be looking for the Jesus of history. So remember, there's that shift in thinking that takes place, and y'all have heard me say this a lot of times. I actually got a great email from somebody that asked a super question about this, wanting to know, was the Enlightenment really that significant in changing the way we think in the West? And the short answer to that is yes. Yes. It is probably the single most important intellectual movement of the recent past that changes everything about Western thought. Beginning in the 18th and 19th centuries, there is this idea among an intellectual elite, but that's where it has its impact. It filters down. There is this idea that human progress is possible in literally every field of human endeavor, that we can leave behind old institutions, old ways of thinking, old forms of government, old institutions of education. There's literally not any aspect of human endeavor that is not affected by this. And what they do is they turn a critical eye on everything. And you might not be surprised to know that when they do that, the institution that is the most suspect, the one that is the most attacked, is the Christian church. It was Voltaire who said, crush the infamous thing, meaning the institutional church. Because he said there's nothing in human history that he thought had done more to impede human progress than the church. So, what that movement does is it takes everything that is a big story, a big narrative, and deconstructs it. The Bible is no longer authoritative. The scriptures are now need to be read through the lens of humanity and not through the way it's always been interpreted. Remember I talked about Jefferson's Bible, where he took the razor and he cut out all the parts of the Gospels that were unreasonable or not rational, which eliminated all the miracle stories? That's the movement I'm talking about, that this comes out of, is this mistrust of the past, and certainly the big stories. So our question became, where is your evidence for this story? Where is your evidence and where is your proof? And you can't appeal to the Bible to answer that question, right? Because we've deconstructed that text. So where is your evidence and where is your proof outside of that this is a true story? That's how this all began, is with the Enlightenment demoting the Bible as an authoritative text. Does that make sense to everybody? That it loses this place in Western thought of having authority, of that weight that, of course, we apply to it. So these deconstructors, for lack of a better term for them, we could probably call them lots of other things, but these deconstructors then began to look for Jesus outside of the text. That's how this all started. So, I hope you're going to see the question is just another variation of that whole faith reason question, isn't it? It's just another variation of it. There is no contradiction at all between the Jesus of faith and the Jesus of reason. There's no contradiction between them. And as someone who has taught the history of Christianity now for many years at the university level, I can say with certainty that neither the church nor academia have really focused much on synthesizing things. That certainly in the academic realm, academic sphere, there's much more of an emphasis on Jesus of history, obviously. The church is much more about Jesus as Christ. But the Catholic Church does embrace the use of our reason. So this is a fair question for us to ask. It's a fair one for us to explore. We don't have to necessarily contrast them. I hope you're going to see that they're the same thing, same person, obviously. So there's really been three very distinct waves, as I talked about, three distinct waves of. Do anybody have any questions about these images before I move on? Anyone? Okay. There's been three very let me say this first. Although there's been three very distinct waves of this, and we're going to talk about those waves in history and what they did in different times and for different reasons. But these are the major questions, I think, that this quest for historical Jesus seems to want to ask. Okay? First of all, can we use the Gospels as historical documents? This has been a big question, particularly in my field, in my discipline. There's kind of two different camps on this. That absolutely they're historical documents because they record events that are from a first-person perspective. Right? And then there is the camp that says, no, because history is really about man, the gospel accounts record things that are beyond man's experience, that are beyond ordinary human experience. And so there's this camp that would say, no, you really can't use that as a historical document. But Jesus was a real human being. And I don't know any serious scholar, by the way, and I've said this before, I don't know any serious scholar who doubts he was a real person. Even people who don't believe that he was the Christ would not argue that he didn't really exist. So if you want to think about it that way, well, then the Gospels are important documents for reasons that I think you're going to see. I want to stop and tell you this too. there's some interesting data. I mentioned that I don't know any serious scholar who doubts that Jesus was a real historical figure. There's some interesting data out there about this, though. They did, a couple of different polls have been done about this in the last decade. On average, only about 20% of people across different polling instruments, different ways this question has been asked, there's only about 20% of people who express a belief that Jesus was not a historical figure, that Jesus is a person of myth. So we're talking about a minority of people, really, which interestingly is down. Do you remember how all of those indicators we've talked about a little bit from that Pew Research, remember this? About how church attendance is down, people who identify as Christian, that number is going down. The Roman Catholic Church is losing numbers faster than any other religious expression. But it's interesting that this number has gone down. The same question that was asked in the immediate post-war period, 1950, 1960, in that time period, this figure was a little higher, that there were more people who thought that Jesus was a myth or a historical, that he had no historical basis, that he was not in fact real. So that number has gone down. I find that interesting. So no, it's not something, as I said, I don't know of a single mainstream serious scholar, even if they're not of religious faith, who believes that he was not a real historical figure. So while we can say, therefore, that billions of people believe that Jesus was a figure of history, even people of no religious faith, there are some who reject the idea. And that's, I think, the question we need to be ready for. So, this question about the Gospels is therefore important, that we be able to know when we say the word history, what are we talking about? And why might the Gospels not be the best source of that? So, for historical inquiry, to make sure everybody understands, history is about man, right? History as a discipline is about man. History demands a written record. So we can have other disciplines that supplement us. We can have archaeology, we can have anthropology, we can have theology is the study of God, by the way, okay? So is there a point where those two things can meet? Can we bring theology and history together? And the pure historian would tell you no. That's the complicated thing about the gospel accounts. They are written records, and they are the only real record we have for a lot of the events of Jesus' life. So, the other question we have, therefore, that naturally follows from that is, well, what about the other parts of the New Testament? What about the epistles? For instance, of St. Paul, the epistles of the other apostles, Peter, James, John. What about those? Can we use those as historical documents? And interestingly, the historical figure of St. Paul, as you're going to hear me talk about, there's a broad consensus about him as a real figure of history. We know a lot about him. And the same people that might diminish the Gospels as a historical record don't tend to do that with the epistles of St. Paul. And that's kind of fascinating. Because he is writing, remember, to churches that he either helped establish or that he had relationships with. So they are placed in historical context. He gives us details about those churches and those people that can be corroborated. Okay? So we have that second question. And then what can other disciplines contribute, especially archaeology, which is kind of an emerging thing in the 20th century that tells us a lot about the Gospels now. And importantly for our purposes today, are there any other historical references outside the Bible to Jesus? So, what are those three different waves that I was talking about? These three different kind of periods of this quest for the historical Jesus, and why did it ever get a negative rap in the first place? Again, I mentioned the Enlightenment, and that's where this really begins. And I don't want to leave you with the idea that I think everything from the Enlightenment was bad. Almost. No, I mean, it certainly ushered in a new way of thinking, but obviously, you do know that our own system of government is a product of the Enlightenment, right? You know that? The great American experiment of the Republic and the representative democracy, that is an Enlightenment idea. So we can't like throw the baby out with the bathwater and say all of it was bad. But it does bring about some criticism and critical deconstruction that has not always been productive or has not always been positive. So in this late 18th to early 19th century, where scholars began to present Jesus in rational terms, where Jefferson is taking the razor to his Bible, for instance, seeking to reduce the miracles to somehow explainable physical events, physical phenomena that any human being could do or could have participated in, and depicting him as a great and wise teacher. Now listen to this, a great and wise teacher. That's what this first movement did. He was a great and wise teacher, great moral teacher. So the first wave really starts there, and at the turn of the 20th century, there's a Nobel Prize winner, Albert Schweitzer, who published a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. And he concluded, after all this talk about this great moral teacher, he concluded that the historical Jesus was a stranger, quote, a stranger. And looking back at what the rationalists like Jefferson and others had tried to do with Jesus would not have been important at all in coming to know who he was, because he said they call him a great teacher. And I love this question he asked. Why would Rome have even bothered to crucify that Jesus? Okay, so if he is, think about it, if historically we reduce him to this great moral teacher, then why bother? Why would Rome have even bothered to crucify that Jesus? And that's a question that other sort of philosophers and theologians of the 20th century began to pick up, is, well, yeah, I mean, you describe him as a teacher and that's all he is. If that's all he is, then he's not significant enough for Rome to have cared about, which is a great point. And he goes on to say that whatever we know about Jesus historically is irrelevant to the Christian faith. And he said, if you eliminate the gospel accounts, he is reduced to such obscurity that he is of no importance at all. If you eliminate all the gospel accounts. So, one of the greatest gifts to the world that came in the 20th century actually came out of the Church of England. He's not a Catholic theologian. I wish we could claim him, but we can't. He came out of the Church of England, mid-20th century theologian by the name of C.S. Lewis. Everybody familiar with him? Wrote a super important text, I think, that actually is required reading in my philosophy class, Mere Christianity. And in that work, he said this when he commented about Jesus as a great teacher, okay? Y'all bear with me. I want to read this quote to you. It is worth repeating in totality, okay? I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher. And remember, he's writing a direct response to this first movement, right? But I don't accept his claim to be God. He said, so I'm writing this. I'm ready, to people who say, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. C.S. Lewis goes on to say, that is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would be either a lunatic, on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he must be a devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and call him a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great teacher. that sort of sums up where this first movement ended, right? In the middle of the 20th century. C.S. Lewis spoke for a lot of people when he said, let's stop calling him that. Let's stop looking at him as a great moral teacher. So the second quest really came about in the middle of the immediately following World War II. Well, really beginning in the 1960s probably is more close to accurate. The beginning of a period we call Post-Modernism. That's the age we live in today, is this postmodern age. And this was really centered in Germany. This came about among some biblical scholars, biblical critics in Germany, who began to argue that the gospel accounts were myth. And they took the stories of the Gospels and attempted to correlate them with other mythological traditions of history. To draw, like there was this great common body of myth. And the Christian Gospels were just one expression of that. So they came up with a set of criteria then for deciding what in the Gospels was in fact historical. What we could say was historical and what was myth. And it might not surprise you to know that when they did this, what they did was eliminate anything that was not pure history. So, for instance, Luke begins his gospel with placing Jesus in a historical context, doesn't he? In the reign of Caesar Augustus, when Quirinius was governor of Syria, when he begins to set the birth narrative, he gives us a historical context. And so these scholars would say, well, okay, that's right, but the rest of the story is not historical. Okay? Really minimizing the role even further. So see, now we've kind of gone to this other extreme. He's not a great moral teacher. He just never existed as a person of history. So now, seemingly interesting, we're in this third wave right now, and I actually found this quite interesting. Looking at Jesus in the setting of history again, but also culturally. Seeking to understand Jesus as the person of history living in a first century Jewish environment. This is what many, many scholars are doing today. And it has been fruitful. It's been helpful because they have access to information and to text that the other two movements did not. For instance, well, that's not necessarily true of the second one, but for instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were a mid-20th century discovery. Not that the Dead Sea Scrolls mention Jesus, because they don't. But you know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are. They were found in Qumran in some caves up near the Dead Sea in 1946, 47. And for instance, they found the oldest known scroll of the prophet Isaiah, complete scroll of the prophet Isaiah, that is 1,000 years older than any other Hebrew text that was previously known to exist. That's big. It's big. And having access to all of these documents that other movements didn't have has helped these scholars to look at Jesus as a Jew. In that Jewish context of the first century, to even look more closely at the prophecy of Judaism, looking at the Messiah figure as a fulfillment of that. There's been really good things that have come out of this last movement. But still very critical. It's still very critical of the biblical text itself. So one thing that I know, I think we can say with certainty, and I really want y'all to think about this, okay, is from the perspective of history. And this is kind of where I begin my history of Christianity class, because it is a secular history class, okay? I begin it here, and I point this out. This is an absolute observation, by the way. Remarkably, the death of this Jesus of Nazareth is counterintuitive to most every historical narrative we have. The death of Jesus of Nazareth did not mark the end of his movement. Okay? You ever really thought about this? Think about this. His followers continue, of course, to present day. The movement itself spread so rapidly. If you ever looked at a map, like a map of early churches and the spread of early churches in the Roman Empire, And there's absolutely no parallel for that in history. The spread of a religious belief system that was and I'm not talking about it in the context of conquest, okay? So let's leave colonialism, colonization, and all that out of it, bringing it to the New World. I'm talking about it in its earliest context. The spread of that was so rapid that it is nothing short of a historical phenomenon, that it spread as quickly as it did. And so how do you as a historian ignore that? What was it about this individual in history? What was it that he said that convinced his followers to not only all, save one I think, go to a horrible death themselves because they had seen something and witnessed something, that they all did that? That again is another phenomenon of history. Right? So when Jesus' followers heard that he was dead, it didn't end. It didn't end there. It grew. And somehow there is this triumph of some higher principle at work in the history. A movement that not only persisted, but transformed the entire foundation of the world. Do y'all know that? If I overstated that? Transformed the entire, this is particularly true in the West, it is the foundation of Western civilization. The message of this one obscure man of history formed everything we understand about law, morality, justice, our ideas about how we live in societies together. Even organizational principles in secular institutions rely on the teachings of this obscure man of history. So you can't get away from that there is this historical phenomenon that is independent of understanding him. There's this whole spread of the movement itself. And I want to go back and say that again, because obviously you have other religious systems that spread. Islam, for instance, spread very rapidly in the 7th century. Again, I am eliminating conquest from this scenario, okay? Islam was spread not necessarily organically as much as it was by conquest in the beginning. Christianity spread organically. There's a message that resonated in the ancient world, and it just went wild. So I think that's really, really important. It runs counter to everything we know about how culture and society of human beings works. So, to go back to this slide for a second, to explore these 4 questions a little bit more, I do want to talk about this. We talked about the Gospels and how there is this idea that we cannot necessarily use them as pure historical documents because they include supernatural events. And I'm going to tell you, I will agree with that. I will agree with that. And I tell my students this. If a man goes into a grave on Friday and he comes out on Sunday, alive again, is that ordinary human experience? No. I'm not saying it didn't happen. And I said this in a secular classroom. I'm not saying that didn't happen. What I'm telling you is it's not the subject of history. That's not the business of history. It would be the business of history to see what came about because of that. But history cannot pronounce on that event. And so a student inevitably will raise their hand and say, well, wait a minute. You've always said that the best history is that written by eyewitnesses, and there were all these eyewitnesses to that event. Which I have to concede, yes. But it is a supernatural event. Right? Do you understand that in the purest sense, that's not history? It doesn't mean it didn't happen. Okay? But what we can take away historically is that the man lived, that he had an incredible following, and they all believed he had risen from the dead. That's the important thing. The resurrection itself is not the subject of history. Not a question of history. Which I'm going to talk about a lot more in one of these sessions that's just titled The Resurrection. Have you seen that in the list? I'm going to talk about that, actually. To apply objective historical analysis really requires us to think critically about that. So here's the other thing. To apply that same kind of objective historical analysis to the Gospels as texts, most New Testament scholars agree on something called Markian Primacy. Y'all ever heard that term before? Markian Primacy. That Mark's gospel was the first one to appear in circulation. We think actually it may have been in circulation as early as the year 60. As early as the year 60. There's been some attempts to place it earlier than that, even earlier than the letters of St. Paul, which must have been written in the 50s. But Mark's account was the first one many people believe to have been written down. It was probably St. Peter's account that Mark wrote. And Matthew, of course, was an eyewitness. Matthew was an apostle. He was an eyewitness to much of what he writes about. Luke was not an eyewitness. Everybody know that? Luke was not a contemporary of Jesus. He was a contemporary of St. Paul. He knew Paul, and he was a medical doctor, but he was also a great historian, by the way. It is Luke that writes the history. Luke tells the birth narrative as a history. He places it in a historical context. And then Luke, of course, is traditionally believed to be the author of the Acts of the Apostles, which is a history book. That, the apostles did this here, and they did this here, and then they did this, and it keeps a chronology. John's gospel, of the last of these four, John's gospel, John is a direct eyewitness. He is a direct eyewitness. But also, all of these are solid. They're all historical. It's just that we have to introduce that rubric of what is history and what is something else. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay? Does that make sense? I need to see some heads nodding. Just a few. Okay. Yeah. I would also add this, that their early appearance actually attests to them. Mark, for instance, was in circulation, as I said, we believe about the year 60. And this is something I often get asked by students who are people who are questioning in general. Will come and say, well, how can you trust those accounts? They weren't written for decades after, Well, this is where it's helpful to lose your 21st century mindset, where we have instant access to information, right? Mark is not tweeting about the resurrection. Nobody, John or Peter didn't run back and get on Facebook and post pictures of the empty tomb. In the ancient world, that was not uncommon. And as a matter of fact, 30 years after the event is kind of a news flash in the ancient world. Do you know that the first biography of Alexander the Great did not appear for 4 centuries after his death? 400 years. Think about that. Is there anybody in here that doubts that Alexander the Great lived? Or that the stories that are told about him were true? But you see, there's kind of a different standard at work, isn't there? Nobody doubts. I mean, it was the Roman historian Quintus who wrote it a long time after Alexander was dead. Drawing upon what? What the oral tradition was about Alexander. That's the ancient world. Herodotus, the Greek historian who tells us the story, for instance, of the Persian Wars. Okay? He's writing long after the events. Herodotus is the one who wrote about how they built the pyramids. 2,000 years before, right? So there is this different standard that seems to be at work in the way we think about text, isn't there? So when people come to me with this question, and it inevitably happens, well, how can you trust these because they're decades older? I'm like, yeah, that'd be the equivalent of getting it in tomorrow's newspaper. Yeah. That's the equivalent in the ancient world. So to me, there really is, it attests to their veracity. It attests to them more because they do appear so early. They do give accounts that include supernatural, miraculous events that are corroborated by one another. Right? That's a whole other thing that we could get into sometime, is lay those 4 Gospels on top of each other and see where they disagree and where they agree. The overwhelming majority, of course, of what they produce in those narratives is consensus, with just enough difference in detail to do what? To make them more convincing. If I brought 4 witnesses in here and interviewed them about something that they had witnessed, something they had seen or participated in, are you going to get the exact same details? You better not. You better not, because that means that they've sort of corroborated on their story. Right? So, The letters of St. Paul, the epistles of the other apostles, as I said, that is a related issue, but applying the same historical method to this, there is actually long-standing, extensive scholarship about St. Paul. The letters of Paul as historical documents. Now, all those scholars today disagree on how many of the letters he actually wrote. Y'all do know that. There's this controversy that he didn't write all the letters that were attributed to him, but that they were produced in communities that he knew and people that he knew wrote them in his name. Leaving that controversy aside, there is great consensus about him as being a real historical figure. We can place him in the Jewish context that he lived in. Everything adds up about him. The fact that he was a Roman citizen, the fact that he was a Greek-speaking Jew, the fact that he established all these churches and wrote to all these churches, led these great four missionary journeys throughout the Mediterranean world. None of that is in doubt. So that's a great place to prop up the stories of Jesus, isn't it? That here is the story of a man who spread that movement. He, again, was not a contemporary of Jesus. Remember, he's called after a pretty dramatic conversion experience on the road to Damascus. So he's not a direct witness to the historical Jesus. But the others, Peter, John, James, they were witnesses. So their epistles are historical documents in those same kind of ways we have to think about the Gospels. So another criticism that's come about really beginning in the 20th century was that, well, there's not enough archaeology of Jesus. There's nothing remaining of him. I'm glad y'all laughed at that. Somebody got that. And I've always found that to be an interesting question. You know, it's like the secular scholar would come and say, well, you don't have any archaeological proof of Jesus' life. There's no remains of Jesus. Do say. Right? You do say. There's not. Isn't that interesting that there's no physical remains? But seriously, what could archaeology contribute to this has been an important question as part of this related search for the historical Jesus. The fact that Jesus didn't leave any physical remains doesn't at all mean that there's no archaeological evidence. Archaeology actually aligns with the gospel accounts pretty well. The synagogue in Capernaum, Peter's house, recent excavations that in Jerusalem that are places described in the Gospels. For instance, the pavement that's described in the Gospels, Jesus' trial, that's a 20th century archaeological discovery. One of the pools of Siloam was a 20th century archaeological discovery. Places that critics would say, well, those places don't exist, and now they're being exposed through the discipline of archaeology. Golgotha itself, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Those are archaeological sites that align with the gospel narratives. You see, so while there is some disputed evidence, and always has been, about ancient Nazareth, the biblical, obviously, childhood home of Jesus, archaeologists have recently unearthed a rock courtyard house along with some tombs, a cistern and a well, in an area that they're thinking must be this biblical Nazareth. So even that part of the story is coming to light through this. They have also found physical evidence of Roman crucifixions, which might not surprise you to know that, although the Romans tended to reuse their instruments. So you might be crucified, and generally crucified people were not permitted burials. Their remains would often just be tossed somewhere or buried in mass graves maybe that we haven't found. It's been very rare to find skeletal remains of someone who's been crucified that we can demonstrate, because the Romans would reuse the nails or the spikes. They were economical. They reused crosses. They reused nails if you were in fact crucified that way. We think many Roman crucifixions were done simply by tying someone to a cross. But recently, I say recently, it's been in the last 40 years, there was a discovery made of a man who apparently had been permitted a burial in an ossuary, the ossuary box, and that spike was driven right through the ankle, right through the foot at the ankle level. So it corroborates, again, not only the crucifixion depicted in the Gospels, but it corroborates the way Jesus' crucifixion has always been depicted in art. It corroborates the wounds we see on the cloth behind me, that it was actually done that way. So, in 1990, and this has not been that long ago. Isn't it interesting how your perspective changes? 1990 was like, what, 30 years ago now? Archaeologists found discovered an ossuary that contained the bones of Caiaphas, the high priest, who of course interrogated Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and is mentioned in the Gospels of Luke and John. So the high priest Caiaphas, that's corroborated now in archaeology. So it's absolute nonsense to say that there's no other discipline that contributes to our understanding Jesus in history. Can we all agree with that? That really is not true. Obviously, we could also look to historical artifacts, to relics, but these are not always the strongest arguments, to come from, as their authenticity can't be verified by any kind of empirical standard. So if somebody comes to you and says, well, the crown of thorns isn't real, or the passion nails, or the piece of the true cross, those can't be real because we can't authenticate them in the record. They're speaking truth. We can't. And so those are not always the best arguments to try to come at to look at the historical Jesus. I will say this about that. The fact that there has been an ongoing question about the nails, the true cross, any of the instruments of the Passion. The fact that we still continue to ask those questions in many ways speaks to its historicity, doesn't it? Do y'all get that? We're still asking. We have evidence of it. We know that in the 4th century, St. Helena, Constantine's mother, went off to the Holy Land on that great archaeological expedition. So in the 4th century, people knew that this had happened. People knew where Golgotha was. They took her to the spot. Something important happens in your backyard. This great story begins in your backyard. Aren't you going to pass that on generationally? This is where that happened. Think of how we mark important sites today. So yeah, that's another way to come at that. Well, St. Helena found what she found because the people there knew where it happened. They took her to the spot. They remembered, you see. So, reaching that empirical standard of proof is going to be impossible. I'm thinking especially of the cloth hanging on the wall behind me. We're never going to reach that point of empirical proof. But there's evidences there. So, the big question is this last one. What about historical documents outside of the Bible? The most detailed record of the life and death of Jesus comes from those Gospels, hands down. That's the most detailed. There's central claims. Let's be Jefferson for just a minute. Let's leave the miracles out of the stories. Okay? We want to apply that rubric of reason and leave those out of the story because they're not rational. Let's do that for a second because I think it's a fruitful enterprise. I really think it's a fruitful exercise. The central claims, when you strip all of that away, the central claims about Jesus as a historical figure, a Jewish man with followers who was executed on the orders of the Roman authority, the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, who, by the way, is a real historical figure. During the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, a real historical figure. those central facts that you can take away from those 4 gospel accounts are corroborated completely in sources outside the Bible. Did everybody hear me say that? The central facts of his life, his movement, his execution, what became of his followers, those are corroborated independently in secular history sources outside of the Bible. Within a few decades of his lifetime, Jesus was mentioned by Jewish and Roman historians in passages that corroborate the Gospels. Okay? Not the miracles, but that corroborate his existence. Those portions of the New Testament, particularly that deal with the life and death of Jesus, are corroborated. So, the 1st century Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, and I actually put some of these in your reader, okay? Excerpts from these in your reader. Again, this will help you when people have questions about Jesus. To be able to answer someone who's looking for reason to believe, this is not a bad place to start. You can introduce somebody to the Jesus that the Jewish and Roman historians of the 1st century knew, and 2nd century knew. Then you might can make the bridge to Jesus as Christ. Does that make sense? Okay. So, Josephus Flavius, Flavius Josephus. Actually, his name appears both ways. The Testimony Flavian, which is either his first or last name. We're not sure exactly what order he put these in. Commonly just known as Josephus to us. He wrote a history. It's called Antiquities, but it's like a 12, 15 volume set. It's massive, but it's in this work, particularly when he's writing about the Jewish wars and the fall of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. It's in that context. And remember that Josephus, according to many scholars, is the best source of information about 1st century Palestine. The best. I know people in my discipline who teach ancient Near East, who teach the ancient world, and this is their go-to text, is Josephus's Antiquities. It's a primary source, right? So I want to stress to you, he's a good source. He's an excellent source. This history that he wrote is written probably about the year 93. Josephus was thought to have been born a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus. We think he was born probably around the year 37, which means that, and living in the area of Judea, which means that as a young person, he would have known people who knew Jesus. Do you see that? He's not that far removed from, maybe not quite a generation removed. And so if he didn't know people who knew him directly, he knew it secondhand from people who knew people who knew people, right? So this is really, really very good. He's a well-connected aristocrat. He was a military leader. He was actually a commander of some of the Jewish forces in Galilee during that first Jewish revolt against Rome. So he's got some on-the-ground experience there too, and he is Jewish. He was not a follower of Jesus. So there is no bias here. There's no attempt to minimize him or to make him something that he was not. He is writing this as a pretty solid history. Many people use Antiquities as a source of the 1st century Palestine because he is an objective source. So in one passage that recounts an execution, Josephus identifies the victim, James, as, quote, the brother of Jesus who is called the Messiah. And while a few scholars doubt, few scholars might doubt that, more debate than that surrounds something that Josephus says a little later, which describes a man who, quote, did surprising deeds and was condemned to be crucified by Pilate. And he goes on and refers to that man as the Christ. Okay, so in your, the excerpt that I gave you, you'll notice that when I quote that passage of Josephus, I have "the" in brackets and bolded. Anybody notice that? That's because there is an emerging consensus among many people, probably myself included, that may have been a later interpolation. "The" might have been added in the Middle Ages by a scribe. Okay? Because that does not appear in the oldest versions of this we have. But to remove the word "the" doesn't take really anything away from the fact that Josephus refers to him as Christ. So, another account of Jesus appears in the, I'm going to jump down here just a little bit, in the Annals, a first century history of the Roman Empire written around the year 116 by a Roman historian named Tacitus. He was a Roman senator, very well connected, wanted to chronicle the burning of Rome. It's kind of what the major part of the work does, the burning of Rome in 64 AD. As a matter of fact, every high school or college history textbook that you pick up that talks about the burning of Rome, they're drawing from Tacitus's account. His was the primary account, as close to reporting it contemporarily as we have. Tacitus mentions that the Emperor Nero falsely blames, quote, the persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities, he says. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. That's a secular history. Okay? As a Roman historian, Tacitus did not have any Christian biases in his discussions of the persecutions of Christians by Nero, and what he says coincides, and from a completely different point of view, coincides with what the New Testament itself, of course, says about Jesus being executed by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, for crimes against the state, and a religious movement that his, and this is interesting how Tacitus puts it, for crimes against the state, and a religious movement of his followers sprang up in its wake. Now, an important point about Tacitus, and I think this is super important to take away. When you read Annals, and I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read portions of it, whenever there is something that he is not sure is correct, he comments on it. He'll make a notation that there is some disagreement about the truth of this, or this fact might not actually be correct, and this is why I think it's not. He comments on it. He doesn't do that here. He relates it as if it were fact. There is absolutely no indication of doubt in this passage about Jesus when he mentions Christus. Around the same time, the Roman governor of Bithynia, a man named Pliny the Younger, was in correspondence. Bithynia is in northern Turkey. Okay. He wrote a series of letters to the Roman Emperor Trajan, and he's tattling on the Christians in northern Turkey, which gives us a great little snapshot, actually, of what Christians were doing, because he says that they have this weird ritual that involves eating flesh and drinking blood. And they've got this, I don't know what this thing is they're doing with water, but there's some ritualistic thing they're doing with water. And basically, and you can read the portion I've excerpted there, that he's tattling on the Christians to the emperor. Okay? And what's interesting about that historically is that the Emperor Trajan responds and says, well, just leave them alone. They're not bothering anybody, leave them alone. Another interesting fact about that corroborates this, I think, in many ways, is that it is really from Pliny the Younger that we have the only account of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Nobody doubts that history. He records that. Some scholars believe that the Roman historian Suetonius, he wrote something called The Lives of the 12 Caesars. It was here about the year 121. So you can see this is all within just a few decades of each other that these accounts appear. And Suetonius, in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, references Jesus this way in noting that, quote, Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome who were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus. But he spells it Crestus, or appears to spell it in a different form than Tacitus does. So that's been some controversy. Are we talking about the same person? And clearly we are. I mean, in context, clearly we are. So obviously, all of these little historical vignettes from non-Christian sources do not give us near as much information about Jesus as the Gospels, do they? No. But they speak loudly about the concept we've been talking about today. Is there a Jesus of history that is independent of the Gospels? Jesus was known by the historians of the earliest decades following his life and death. The immediate succeeding era knew Jesus. They knew about his movement. They knew about his followers. They knew about the rituals. They're writing about the rituals. Known by those who had looked into the origins of the movement. This is especially true of Tacitus. He's rigorous in exploring what is the evidence for this. How do I corroborate this? Who testifies about this? And none of these ancient writers believed him to be an imaginary made-up figure. They knew. They knew the Jesus of history. So when we confront those in the world who are looking for this, as I said, reason to believe, we can indeed point to this historical Jesus. Before maybe we introduce them to the Jesus of faith, we can point them to the Jesus of history. There are some important other, I hope you can take this away today, some other indicators that we can be able to share with others. The gospel accounts are historical in the sense that they do not dispute the secular history we have about Jesus. Do you understand? Those two, they don't dispute. They're corroborated by non-Christian writers, and they are corroborated by archaeology. They appear very early in the history of the Christian movement. Their authorship was not in dispute until very modern times. Nobody said that St. Paul didn't write his letters until the 20th century. Nobody said that John wasn't the author of Revelation until the 20th century. Right? Nobody disputed that until very, very recently. The biblical criticism of the 20th century is really what has contributed to a lot of the discussion and debate that's going on out there. And the other thing I hope you take away is that the records of Jesus and his movement outside of the Bible are from non-biased, non-Christian sources. So if somebody's looking for something that's not a Christian polemic, a Christian argument, sacred scripture, you can start with the Jesus of history. Right? You can start there. Why do you think people ask the question? I mean, I think that's what we also need to contemplate when we go away today. Why do we ask that question? Why would anybody ask that question? Where is the evidence? Where is the proof? That's where people are coming from when they ask that. Where is the evidence? Where is the proof? Now that we've deconstructed the Bible as an authoritative source. Right? So, what can we conclude? Jesus of Nazareth lived in first century Palestine. He had followers. He was executed by the Roman authorities. And his followers believed so much that he had risen from the dead that most of them went on to brutal deaths themselves, and they established the foundations of a religion that would change the entire face of the world. That's what you can take away. All of that is historical. Okay, so something I'm going to look at in a few weeks, as I mentioned, was the resurrection. Looking at that as a historical event is quite the challenge, but it's kind of fun to unpack all that. And what is it about that event specifically that aligns with our human reason? How is it that a supernatural or super rational event, something that is clearly not rational and doesn't happen every day, how is it that something like that actually aligns with our reason? That's going to be a lot of fun to look at. What is it that makes it true, therefore? Because it does align with our human reason. So next week, on October 3rd, I would encourage, we're not meeting in here, but please join the rest of the parish community for the recitation of the Rosary in the cathedral. It's Respect Life Sunday. And then on October 10th, I will not be here. I'm actually going to be at the Museum of the Bible that weekend in Washington, D.C., talking about this cloth behind me. And Father Jerry will be here, and he's going to be with you on that morning of Sunday the 10th, looking at some topic related to the year of St. Joseph, some aspect of Joseph's life. I'm not exactly sure what he's doing, but it'll be great. And then on the 17th, we had already built in fall break, so I actually won't see you until the 24th when we resume the series, and then Father Jerry does one more class, I believe. Father Peter's helping me with one in November, so you don't have to look at me the whole time, okay? We're breaking it up a little bit, but I want to thank you guys for coming and bearing with this. If you don't have the reading resource, let me know. I've got them in the closet, and I'll get one for you. And for anybody who's watching, we've had a few people that have watched this this past week. Anybody that's watching that doesn't have the resource, we're going to link those in the church office too for you to pick up. So thank you guys for coming this morning. I'm going to turn this off, and then I'll take any questions you might have, okay?